you so much to all of you who for coming. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end, but you can start by putting questions in the chat while the talk is going on. So we just celebrated Tu B'Shvat earlier this week, and to jog everyone's memory, Tu B'Shvat is a Jewish holiday, sometimes called the birthday of the trees. In Judaism, one is not supposed to eat a tree's fruit for the first 4 years after planting. Tu B'Shvat is the day that each tree is considered to have aged a year. Nowadays, it's become an environmentalist holiday that's often known as the Jewish Earth Day. It's a time for Jews to remind themselves of their duty to care for the natural world. To celebrate, many Jews take part in a tree planting ceremony or send money to plant trees elsewhere. So to ground us all in the intention, or as we put it in Hebrew, the kavanah of tonight's program, I'd like to share a Talmud story that's always been very important to me. One day, Choni HaMagael, a scholar and wonder worker from the 1st century BCE, was walking along the road when he saw a certain man planting a carob tree. Choni said to him, "This tree, after how many years will it bear fruit?" The man said to him, "It will not produce fruit until 70 years have passed." Choni said to him, "Is it obvious to you that you will live 70 years, that you expect to benefit from this tree?" He said to him, "That man found himself in a world of carob trees. Just as my ancestors planted for me, I too am planting for my descendants." This story feels especially meaningful to me right now because one of tonight's panelists is my daughter. Now I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Greenwood, the co-leader of BK's Dayenu Circle. Stephanie is also the co-leader. She's the co-leader of the BK Dayenu Circle, and she's also the senior strategy officer for economic justice at the Victoria Foundation, which partners with Black and Brown residents and other marginalized communities in Newark, New Jersey. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for joining tonight and to our speakers. And especially to Ariel, who's chairing our education committee for our BK Dayenu Circle. As Ariel mentioned, this program is being sponsored by BK Dayenu. We are a chapter of Dayenu, a Jewish Call to Climate Action, which is a national group of American Jews working to confront the climate crisis. And our circle is one of dozens across the country. And it's led by some of the folks on this call tonight and many others. We have adopted a working mission that says, grounded in the Jewish mandate to pursue justice and repair the world, we participate in campaigns to move money out of fossil fuels and into renewable energy and green jobs, support climate and environmental justice campaigns led by frontline communities in Essex County, and work internally and in coalition to build the healthy, just, climate-safe communities we want for ourselves and our children. So it's really a special pleasure to be welcoming Eve and Crystal to the program tonight. I have had the good fortune to work with the New Jersey Tree Foundation as part of the work Ariel mentioned in Newark, and I'm really inspired by the tree planting work that they do. And Eve, I'm really excited to learn from you tonight. Eve grew up at BK and is studying ecology and has been doing important work of her own in forest health in New Jersey. So maybe just by way of a little bit more formal introduction, I'll say quickly that Crystal is the program coordinator at the New Jersey Tree Foundation's Renaissance Trees program. It's a statewide organization dedicated to planting trees in New Jersey cities where the need is greatest. And Eve is a senior at Princeton University, majoring in ecology and evolutionary biology. And she did a gap year as a land steward at the Sourland Conservancy in Hopewell, New Jersey, planting 20 saplings a day. She also worked for 6 months on Aina Pula Pula. Yes?
Yeah, Aina Pula Pula.
An organic farm in Hawaii. So really, we're very fortunate that both of you are joining us tonight to help us celebrate Tu Bishvat with this education. I am going to throw some questions out to you. I should actually, those who have not yet introduced themselves in the chat, I want to encourage you to type your name into the chat and just let us know if you're here through an organization, which organization that is, or through a family member, as we heard before, just so that we can stay in touch with you and continue to grow our network and grow our numbers. So I'm going to start off asking both of you to say a few words about your perspective on how trees can help us address the climate crisis and support our ecosystems. And within that, sort of which trees are the most helpful? Sort of how would you sort of characterize the role of trees in addressing the climate crisis? Crystal, maybe I'll ask you to start and then I'll turn to Eve.
Sure. So I don't know too much about like specific trees and their like role in climate change. I feel like that might be like more Eve's thing. But I mean, trees are obviously, we all know they absorb carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas.
Ariel.
And they store carbon dioxide, which obviously is going to help alleviate climate change. I did see like a study that urban forests across the US are able to sequester around 37 million tons of carbon a year, which is honestly way more than I thought. And that's specifically just urban trees, which we normally don't really think of as a forest. The way I think about trees and climate change more is how they can help to alleviate like the symptoms and the effects of climate change, especially in the cities. So they can, like our cities especially are really prone to a lot of flooding, which is getting worse because of more precipitation due to climate change. They're really prone to the urban heat island effect, which is when cities are a lot hotter than the areas surrounding them. And then trees can really help to alleviate both of these things. They can also help to improve the air quality, take pollutants out of the air, which again, somehow climate change even makes our air quality worse by creating like higher levels of ozone and particulate matter. And then not super related to climate change, but I just personally really like trees because of how they like support wildlife, which is always important.
Crystal, I think you really touched on so many different aspects of how important trees are for fighting the climate crisis and the important role they serve in supporting our ecosystems. I think part of what makes this question so interesting to me is that it gets at the idea of sort of what are we getting out of the ecosystem? And so we're getting so many things from our ecosystem in terms of preventing natural disasters, preventing flooding, air purification. Stephanie was talking a bit earlier about how it can prevent heat, like it can help lower heat temperatures in different areas, especially urban areas during heat waves. There's so many different benefits that we have in terms of mitigating the climate crisis through trees. I think something that's also really important and that I think sometimes is overlooked by environmentalists is that one of the ecosystem services, one of the things that we get out of the environment is also our connection to the environment in terms of the leisure, the spiritual and emotional benefits that we get from the environment. And there is such a strong benefit of having trees as an entry point for people to become more interested in fighting climate change. And so factually, planting trees and having trees helps fight climate change, but it also gets people excited about fighting climate change and feel involved in the movement. And it's a really important entry point.
Thank you for both of those responses. We have, as you heard in the overview, we have represented somebody who's working on the urban forest canopy, trees in the cities, and someone with experience in our woodland forests in New Jersey. And so I wonder if I could ask each of you to speak about what tree canopy means in terms of equity in New Jersey and how we want to think about the health of the forest in the cities and in the woodlands from an equity point of view and from a sort of a ecosystem health point of view.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to show that slide that you had now, because I feel like that would be relevant. So yeah, Stephanie had this map, which I've seen a lot. You know, if you're all familiar with Essex County, the part in red is Newark, which is generally much lower income than pretty much every town surrounding it. Not only that, but there's like a far higher population of minorities in Newark. And as is very obvious in this map, there's not a lot of trees. And the parts of Newark that are pretty green tend to be the ones that are wealthier. And it's not just a Newark thing. That's in cities all across New Jersey, cities all across the country. Like, it's not a coincidence that the places and communities that have like historically been invested in have more trees, and the ones that have been disinvested in don't have trees. That was pretty on purpose. When I was like researching this question a little bit, I found out they did a study due to like redlining, which, I mean, it hasn't been done for a while, but community, like redlined communities had about half as much tree canopy as non-redlined communities. And we're still feeling the effects of that today. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think as Stephanie and Crystal were discussing, the existence of trees in our spaces and in our homes and where we live is an equity issue. And it's a representation of who is receiving resources and who is receiving care and support. And so it has, you know, these very tangible effects in terms of surface temperature, definitely. And then also to harken back to the, you know, ecosystem services of getting people excited about things, having that like spiritual and emotional connection with the environment, to have that in urban spaces is so important. So in terms of, you know, the health of our ecosystem, it's critical. And there have been some studies about redlining, and you can see tangible effects in the ecosystems of these urban areas and areas that are redlined as wealthier or poorer districts. And so you can see, you know, the gaps in the canopy, but also that there's less biodiversity in the areas where that have been redlined and, you know, redlined as like a poorer district, essentially. And that has larger implications about how the ecosystem overall is functioning, which can interact with the different effects of climate change.
So Eve, one of the things you mentioned is the kind of spiritual and aesthetic value of trees. There's some, to me, very interesting studies about physical and mental health associated with proximity to trees that really bear that out. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about forest health in New Jersey and some of your experience with the Sauerland Conservancy and sort of what you think healthy forests mean for the state of New Jersey, and as we think about climate change and as we think about our ecological well-being.
So there are a lot of factors influencing the health of New Jersey's forests. And they kind of go together that makes the forest in sort of a tough way. And so there's definitely climate change in terms of the amount of water that the trees are getting, the weird seasons, the heat, that's certainly affecting our forest. And then there's also the invasive species that are coming and disrupting the forest, very specifically the emerald ash borer has had a really huge impact. It's this species, this insect that came from abroad, and it has decimated the ash trees in New Jersey, and is continuing to spread through other regions. And it just knocks out all these ash trees. And the thing about ash trees is they're one of the earlier successional species. So in New Jersey, you have a lot of these farmlands that are now like slowly being converted into forests, and it's really amazing. But the ash trees are one of the first trees that try to transform what was once a farm into a forest. And so if you lose that, you're losing this really key player in this transformation process. And then you also have this other factor of the deer overpopulation decimating, like destroying all the native plants essentially, because they're just eating everything that they can reach. And there's no way for native plants to come up and replace the gaps in the canopy that the dead ash trees are leaving. And so I worked with the Sourland Conservancy planting trees because, their mission is to currently try to give the native trees a bit of a fighting chance to try to replace the dying ash trees. And so what we would do is we would put tubes around saplings so that the deer couldn't get in and eat the saplings, and that the saplings could grow to fill up the gaps in the canopy. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question about sort of what kind of tree planting is the most important or beneficial from a climate and an ecology point of view. I'm thinking about particularly there's some discussion of greenwashing from companies who are engaging in either polluting activities or in logging, and they are sort of offering the planting of saplings as a compensation for their activities. I wonder if you could both speak to that sort of, is there good and bad tree planting? And how do you suggest we think about sort of greenwashing in this space? I don't know who wants to tackle that.
You can go first with that.
Oh, okay, gotcha. I mean, there are ways to plant a tree carelessly, and there are ways to plant a tree with care. And so if you want to cut corners as a company and say, I'm planting this many trees, and not really do it in such a way that's actually going to work out, you totally can do that. And you can get away with it with this greenwashing system. So for example, say I have a plot of land and I'm planting trees in my plot of land. If I plant all the trees really close together, the trees can't be super close together. They're not going to grow well close together. Some will make it, some won't. It's very unlikely that if they're at a high density, they'll do well, because they need to be able to spread out their roots and have space for sunlight, like to reach out to the sky and receive sunlight. And so what you can do if you wanted to greenwash or do, kind of get around things, is you could plant the trees really close together, and that's probably a cheaper option. But it's not necessarily the most effective way to reforest or try to plant trees. So there definitely are ways to do that, that companies are taking advantage of.
Yeah, I was gonna say pretty much exactly that. Another thing that I have seen, like, we all see these companies that are like, we're planting 1 billion trees. And like Eve said, like, are you planting them well? Like, are they all actually going to survive? But really, like, the maintenance and care of the trees is critical. And it's like something that a lot of times they're like, okay, well, we've planted the trees, like, that's it, job done. You still need to like water them and look after them, make sure that deer aren't eating them. Like, right. It's not just like a one day, like, okay, we've saved the plant and now it can keep polluting. Yeah. And then another thing is like something that we've come across like as a nonprofit a lot is people are like really undervaluing how much it actually costs to plant a tree, because I think of all these campaigns that are like $1 plants 1 tree, and like that's not true. Like you need that might buy the sapling maybe.
Maybe.
But you need staff to plant it, you need staff to maintain it, like equipment, like, so then, we'll get people who are like, what do you mean if I donate $100 to you, you can't plant 100 trees for me? Like, there's just like a misconception about like
Mhm.
what planting a tree actually takes and how much you actually have to care for it. You can just throw them in the ground and like hope for the best and be effective.
So we have a couple of questions in the
Yeah.
chat. I just wanted to also throw in, sorry, based on my experience in Newark, there's some laws on the books. Maybe this is true in all the towns, that if you cut down a tree, you are supposed to check with the town first. Some towns don't allow you to just cut down trees, even if they're on your own land. And developers at least in the Newark context, if they're taking down trees, they owe the city money to plant new trees. And for a long time, the formula was a sapling formula. You could take down a big, huge, old, mature tree and you could pay to replace it with a sapling. So the sort of the environmental services provided by the tree are really not at all comparable. To your point about not spending enough or not sort of thinking enough about the real cost of a tree. So the questions in the chat are, does the variety of trees matter in the replanting, the kind of species mix? And then there was another question about whether we can plant trees here in the northeastern US in a way that somehow compensates for deforestation in the equatorial regions in the Amazon.
That such great questions. I'm so glad people are asking for that clarification. The variety of trees absolutely matters. That's another way that you can really cut corners if you wanted to do things wrong. If you wanted to do things right, you'd have a variety of species, ideally ones that work well together and also that are adapted to the environment that you're planting them in. So for example, I might want to plant native trees, but I need to make sure that, for example, if I'm planting in a wetland area, these are trees that can survive with what we call wet feet. We have to make sure that the trees that we're planting, even if they're native trees to this region, are adapted to the conditions that we're putting them in. And then also to address the question about trees planting here, making up for elsewhere, we have to think about the kind of trees that we're replacing other trees with. I mean, the biodiversity of, the equatorial regions is unparalleled. I mean, it's all about the connection of species and these old growth trees. It's just something that like trying to recreate that delicate, intricate tapestry of biodiversity. It's just almost impossible. It's just like a craze. It would be so difficult to do. And so it's so much more important to try to protect those areas with really high biodiversity. And and they're not equivalent to just planting a tree here.
I don't really have anything to add. I was just gonna say, yep, I agree. And also like with the deforestation too, like when you cut down trees, especially those giant old trees, you're not only like removing those trees' ability to absorb carbon dioxide, but you're like literally releasing it into the air because those forests are storing so much carbon. So like I feel like it's almost like incomparable, like the like deforestation. Like it's great if we can, plant more trees here, but like I don't think realistically it like could make up for totally clear cutting the Amazon.
Here, there's another good question in the chat. Thinking about climate change that we are already facing, even if we are wildly successful in averting disaster, what kinds of trees should we be thinking of planting in our area, given that conditions are going to change? So Crystal, this is, I know, a question that comes up for the Tree Foundation a lot because you have to plant tough street trees that are going to survive the salt, and the runoff and the air pollution in the cities. What are you thinking about in terms of what kinds of trees are going to survive here?
Really, it is definitely something we've been thinking about. The hard thing is with climate change, especially in New Jersey, I feel like we're not sure exactly what's going to happen yet. we're like, are we getting more rain or are we getting a 3-month-long drought like we did last summer? Like, we don't really know which direction it's going. So it's hard to like plan for like what species are we going to pick? I don't know. Are we going to be like the Pacific Northwest in a few years? Or are we going to be like, the climate of South Carolina? Like, we don't know. But we have kind of been considering that a little, like maybe species that have like a further south range, we could try planting them, because it probably is in general going to get a little bit warmer. But mostly we're just continuing to try and plant species that are really hardy and can withstand, which generally anything we plant in the city is already pretty hardy. So just avoiding those like fickle, sensitive trees.
Yeah, absolutely. I think touching on like the idea of hardiness, part of what makes like a plant hardy is that its physical attributes are aligned with its environment. And so it has the attributes that can allow it to survive in that area. And so it's really going to be hard to predict exactly what the hardiness is going to need to be in what direction in terms of resiliency of, being able to withstand drought or in heat or like fluctuating temperatures. But in general, I would say that still planting native plants, maybe native plants that are a little bit further south, is the best bet. In part because they're part of the tapestry of the whole ecosystem of like plants, animals, birds, all these other species that interact with the native plants. And so that you're sort of helping to restore this system that is still existing, but in fragments.
Joan has asked a question that is very close to my heart about tree trimming and the PSE&G tree contractors. And so I know this is probably something we've all seen in our lives, that the utility company comes through and all they see is the clearance around the power line that they need, and they unbalance trees and they trim them in a way that is compromising to the tree's health and is unsightly. So to me, this is a question that raises a sort of advocacy point, right? Like, what, in both of your views, what do you think we as people who are concerned about tree canopy in our area should be doing? In the particular case, if we see a kind of a really careless contractor working for a utility company, or just in general, we can come back to this later, but are there sort of advocacy points that you would each recommend for people in New Jersey who are concerned about trees?
I would definitely, reach out directly to like the utility companies who are hiring these people for sure. I think a couple of years ago, they did pass something, which a lot of tree people were upset about, that the utility companies have basically full jurisdiction of like anything within the right of way, like within a certain, area from their power lines, which is like fair because like, someone said the trees, they can get tangled. If there's a storm, it can cause issues. So like, I understand, like we can't just let trees grow unchecked into power lines. That said, there's definitely a right way to prune a tree and a wrong way. And way too many times the contractors that they hire are just like completely topping the trees. And it's not necessary. Like there are ways to cut around the wires and like not completely massacre the tree. And they just don't do it. And it's so frustrating.
I would say being really loud with your neighbors is a good idea. Having experienced this, both living in Newark and living in Bloomfield, like getting local elected officials to call the power company and hassle them. It's a little bit of a squeaky wheel political response, but I really appreciate that question. We got a question in the chat that is also a question that Ariel prepared about mycelial networks. I don't know if others on this call have gone as deep a dive as I have with some of the literature that's come out lately about how trees can talk to each other through their root systems, and they and the mushrooms hang out underground. So could you speak to sort of trees as part of a larger living ecosystem, and sort of what that means in terms of the health of the climate where we are, both in the city and in the forest. First of all, for people who haven't done this rabbit hole dive that I have, do you want to either of you say a quick word about what the heck this mycelial network business is? I can try to do it if I'm the one that's like nerded out the most on this.
It's hard to sort of describe very concisely because there is so much ongoing research about what's happening and so many discoveries going on now. But in essence, that trees are able to communicate with each other based on the fungal networks under the ground, and they send signals to each other chemically. And so this is part of this larger system of trees, and the mycelium also is really important for maintaining soil fertility as well. And it's just sort of a representation of the larger, greater connectiveness. Because, you know, when we walk into a forest, right, we don't see what's underground, but there's so much going on under there that we can't even imagine, that we're just beginning to understand. And so that's part of why this idea of, you know, cutting down old growth forests and then trying to plant new trees elsewhere, it just doesn't quite work, because there's this sort of element to a forest, this connectedness that makes these groups of trees greater than the trees as individuals. And that connectedness takes a really long time to develop.
I think that was really well put. Yeah, I think the gist is that there's a really, really complex interconnection between and among the trees and the fungal organisms in the soil. And it can't be replicated by plantation tree planting. That's all monoculture. And the health of the soil is completely critical to our agriculture and to our ecosystem health. And so there's just a lot we don't even understand yet, as Eve is saying, about the benefits we receive from a healthy, intact forest canopy. And so that's even more, I think, to the point that we need to be advocating for forest health and ongoing learning about it. We have, sorry, Crystal, did you want to say any?
No, I don't really have anything to add.
Okay.
I had something I wanted to add is about the nature of this process, is that the forest is part of like this larger picture, all these complicated patterns that we're not necessarily privy to, that we don't necessarily that's not at our scale. It's at a larger scale than us. And so the process of trying to restore, protect, and recreate forests requires us to be very careful and work very delicately, trying to align what we are restoring and what we're repairing with what was before, what came before. It's almost like weaving a tapestry that someone else has made and trying to repair certain patches. It's a really delicate process that has to be done very respectfully.
Thank you. So I have just like one or two more questions, then I was gonna invite anyone to come off mute and engage in a discussion about what we can do collectively to support our tree canopy. I wanted to ask each of you to say just sort of a personal word about experience that you've had with trees, what drew you to work with trees and forests, and anything you want to share about your personal experiences in this field.
I mean, I've always been like a nature person. Like I grew up down in the Pine Barrens, so I was surrounded by nature. And then I went to school at Montclair and I was living in Newark. And I was like, wow, this is different. So much less nature here. Something that I really, really love, specifically about my job, is when we do get a lot of like volunteers and residents and stuff who come out, and they've never planted a tree or like really worked outside in any way. Like,
So can I interrupt you, just ask you to say just a quick thumbnail version of what the Tree Foundation does? So
Oh,
that
yeah,
people know what
sure.
you mean?
So the way we work is we generally work in cities, so primarily like Newark and Camden, and we do really community-based tree plantings. So we wait for like residents to reach out to us to request a tree, and then we'll work with them to like talk to their neighbors, because we have like a 10 tree minimum for a planting to be like cost effective. Then we'll go around with them, talk to their neighbors, try and get other people in the block on board, and then I'll organize a tree planting of usually between like 10 and 20 trees within a couple blocks of each other, and they're all planted by volunteers. So and it's pretty much all in city areas except for a few like random parks sometimes. But a lot of the people who come out to volunteer or who are receiving trees like have never like gardened or really worked outside. A lot of people live in apartments and just like don't have the opportunity, or even if they have a yard, they just, you know, like it's not been important to them. And like I've never had someone come and say like I've had such a bad time planting a tree. Like everyone's always like, oh, this is so cool. Like,
Planted on my block in Newark a bunch of years ago, and it was a great experience.
yeah. Yeah, it's like everyone just has so much fun and like feels like more connected to nature. I feel like they're like, oh, I want to like go home and see if I can plant a tree in my yard. And like that just always makes, that's my favorite part of the whole job, is like introducing people to like trees and environmental stuff who otherwise really wouldn't take any interest at all in it.
Eve, do you want to say a little bit about your personal connection to this issue, or any personal
Yeah, definitely. I don't know. I've always been really fascinated by nature and how the natural world works, and just really curious about how plants grow and just sort of like the workings of the world. And as I learned more about the world, how the world works, or how we believe the world to work, I learned more about climate change, and I became more aware of the destruction and the the damage that's being done to our environment. And I became more interested in trying to help and trying to tikkun olam. And I sort of wound up thinking a lot about trees, because that was, you know, the forest ecosystem was part of what made me so curious about the environment and how things worked. I really enjoyed my time at the Sauerland Conservancy planting trees. It was such a wonderful thing to know that I was helping to, you know, close the gaps in the canopy. And I also really enjoyed, you know, working with retirees and Girl Scouts who came to planting events. It was just, yeah, as Crystal said, just such an amazing experience to be able to share the joy of taking action and in for the environment. It's such a joy.
You're here. Well, I'd like to just invite questions and discussion from the folks that are here. Feel free to come off mute or put your question in the chat and I will read it.
I did answer a question in the chat about how many trees we've planted. I don't know exact off the top of my head how many in the past 5 years, but total we've done 4,119 trees in Newark since 2006.
That's
So
a great big number. That's really, really great. I wonder, you know, I know something that's of interest in at B'nai Keshet is food security. And one of the things I have been curious about lately is the relationship of trees to food security. And I wonder if either of you have come across or have any thoughts, or anyone on the call has any thoughts about planting fruit and nut trees as part of a sort of overall climate resilient and healthy communities play for gleaning essentially and sort of foraging. So yeah, any thoughts about that while people think about their questions and put them in the chat?
yeah, I mean, so for me personally, I would love it if our street trees could just be filled with like fruit trees and nut trees that people can just walk by and pick. Some cities do have like ordinances against that actually. I don't know if Newark is one, but I wouldn't be surprised if they are.
No, we don't have that. We have a lot of other bad ones, but we don't have that one.
But you know, even if you can't plant it along the street, like community gardens, planting, you know, fruit trees, shrubs, vegetables, whatever that's just like accessible for the community. Like I'm all for it. I think that every vacant lot should just be turned into a garden, in my opinion.
Oh,
Need a sec. Hi, it's Pace in Lexington. So we do have a local nonprofit gardening organization that has 11 community gardens, and they do have fruit and nut trees in them. They're just hard to use along the street and stuff because they're so messy.
Yeah.
Take a lot of maintenance. But one thing, speaking of political action, Lexington, Kentucky actually has a street tree replacement grant program. So if you lose one of these big old street trees, you can apply to get a cost sharing to have it taken down by a professional, not like, you know, Joe's chainsaw, and replaced with an approved tree. And they have an emphasis on natives in the approved tree. So we've actually, and is it 3 street trees we've done on the grant?
Nice.
Most recently, a bald cypress.
Ooh, I love those.
Andy. Andy, you have to unmute. Andy, unmute.
You're still muted, Andy.
And the other thing, while he's unmuting,
Yes, and I was about to say, we've replaced some big old water maples, which get old, but throw out a lot of leaves and fall apart easily. When we've replaced them all with natives. And the last one was a ball cypress, which I'm really excited about, which surprisingly enough, I always thought of it as a swamp tree, but they tell me it will thrive here in our limestone clay soils of Lexington.
I think there's also a really fun opportunity to consider, you know, different trees that like maybe don't get as much attention, different tree species. There's been a lot of talk about pawpaw trees actually in New Jersey. Yeah, and so I had the chance to plant some pawpaw trees in some of the forests that I was working with, the Sauerland Conservancy, and that was really exciting to be able to plant those trees. And I'm really excited to see what happens with those. But yeah, there are other, you know, fruits and nuts and trees that we don't necessarily eat as much. It's interesting because like I'll see like mulberry trees in Montclair, for example, and that no one's eating the fruit. Yeah, no one's eating the fruit. And so in some ways there are already fruit trees and nut trees that we're not using them, or people aren't using them as they could be.
It's a good point. Joan, I think I see your hand.
Yeah. So the first part of the question is there a census of trees? And I ask that because I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which had Dutch elm disease when I was growing up. And every tree was gone because all the streets were planted with arching Dutch elm. They were gone. Well, if you go there now, it's beautiful. All the streets are lined with trees. They all over arch, create shade. They're beautiful canopy. And I come back to Montclair, and I moved to Montclair in 1986, and my street was lined with trees. Now about a third of the street is lined with trees, and all the backyards are losing their trees. A part of it is the ash borer, but insurance companies are asking when properties change hands to cut down any trees next to the house because they won't insure. There are people who don't want trees on their yards because of sewers and sidewalks. There are far fewer trees, and it really concerns me because in my view, Montclair is going the wrong way. It's not going the right way. So, you know, is there any kind of census? Is anybody keeping track? And you know, is there nationally, are there places where people are doing census and keeping track?
So I can say Crystal, you look like you might have some information about this. What I can say is that I think the short answer is no. There's
Yeah.
not, I mean, at the national level, the Forest Service does this kind of aerial mapping, which is different from a tree census. The tree census work that I've come across is very locally based. So we did some in Newark. One of the things that that is possible, and it'd be interesting to think about it for Montclair, is a shade tree commission. That's something towns can do. And then there's a kind of officially impaneled body of residents that steward the trees and advocate for the tree canopy. And I know that might be a location to say, hey, we need a town ordinance that your insurance company cannot say, take the tree down because it's detracting from the public good. So I know we have a couple more questions in the chat that I want to get to, and I saw Froma had a hand up, but I don't know if she's in a position to ask. While you're getting back to your chair, there's a question about shade, and I did want to just really plug this urban heat island benefit of trees. It is different to stand under an awning and to stand under a tree. And this is a magic fact about trees. They don't just block the sun, they actually absorb heat from the air. It is cooler under a tree than under an awning for that reason. And there's about, I think, a 7 to 10 degree difference right now between the suburbs, the leafier suburbs and the more treeless urban areas in New Jersey. And in the summer, when it's like in the 90 to 100 range, those 7 degrees really matter for health and well-being. So yes to the person who asked about shade. And then somebody put a question in the chat to say we have a high school science teacher here, which is fantastic. Please feel free to come off mute and ask a question if you have one. But the question in the chat is, what can her students do? What should her students be thinking about with regard to these problems? So Eve and Crystal, do you want to take a crack at that one, and then we can open it back up?
Yeah, so I think, just really, I feel like starting locally is kind of the best way you can be effective with tree planting. So if your town has like a shade tree commission or a green team or, any sort of entity that might be able to plant trees, go to their meetings. I assure you, those meetings want young people. They need young people. Like go to those meetings. If your town has like green fairs and stuff, just like see if there's anything going on that you can volunteer at. We've even we plant at schools all the time. So see if literally just talk to your school administrator, see if they'd be willing to plant some trees and get the students out there to help plant them. But I feel like it's really the best way to be effective is just to start planting where you live or pretty close to it.
I just want to cut in for a minute because I work at the library, and in the Bellevue Avenue branch uptown, they're starting a seed library. And they're planning to give away seeds, and they're hoping that people will eventually come back with more seeds. And they're, targeting young people with seed planting initiatives. So there are a lot of different ways to get involved, sometimes through your local institutions, like your library, your synagogue, and so forth.
Thank you. That is very cool, a seed library.
And if kids happen to be part of a scout program or any kind of thing that expects a service activity, contacting a friends of whichever park or reserve and volunteering their time to do tree plantings as well.
But I'm sorry. I was just listening to a program the other day that said the temperature of the earth has risen almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And that if we're not cool about it, it's going to get to 3 pretty soon. And, I think that what's left of the Arctic Circle will fit into this cup, right? That's about it. And so what I was wanting to ask, and it's maybe just beyond the scope, but it seems to be fundamentally important, the Amazon region, it's just fundamentally important, and it's going away. And, just reckless behavior on the part of countries and companies. And what can we do? I mean, we're desperate, just absolutely, when the entire world has heated up 2 degrees, and you look at the horrible heat waves in Europe and the fires and stuff like that. What could we do?
I really appreciate that, John. Like, we are sitting in the middle of
Yeah.
that urgency, right?
Pardon?
And we know we're
Pardon?
sitting in the middle of that urgency, I said, and we know that any one tree we plant is not going to address it. And so as we come to the end of our hour, I wonder if Crystal and Eve, if you and then anybody else on the call can share your thoughts about what we can do, sort of as that be our sort of closing question politically, because, as well as personally around this issue.
It's such a multifaceted issue, and that is the issue, right? Is because if this were an easy issue to address, we would have tried to address it, or we would be addressing it better than we are now. And there's so many different aspects to how that could be addressed. But as Crystal said, I think one of the greatest things that we can do as individuals is to think locally. Where in my community or where in the communities around me do there need to be trees? Or can I start a community garden? Like, it's from a community that so much larger change can happen. In terms of, bigger picture, thinking about the Amazon or other regions, the Arctic Circle, all those other places, there are definitely things we can do, like voting and contacting our representatives and making sure that we're up to date about what's going on in our world. Yeah, it's very difficult. I think one thing that I try to do, because I have the resources and the the privilege to do so, is that I try to make sure that my consumption aligns with my values in terms of like buying secondhand, trying to bike rather than drive a car. But to a certain degree, it's not really entirely up to us about the carbon emission side of things. Yeah.
Crystal,
Yeah.
any words for us about what we can do, and particularly what people do to support the Tree Foundation? And then we are actually at the top of our hour. So after Crystal's comments, I'll do a sort of last call, and then close out with some final thoughts. Ariel, I see your hand as well. Crystal, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much exactly what you've said. Like, it's a huge problem that no one person, no one tree planting is going to be able to fix. And it's especially hard watching like the Amazon rainforest. I don't live in Brazil. I don't vote down there. Realistically, I could donate to some organizations, but I know that there's not much impact I can have. But that said, I feel like with the whole climate change thing, it is just like so important not to get like disheartened about it and be like, well, there's nothing we can do, because even if you can't like change things that are happening all across the world, like you still can like walk out into your front yard and plant a tree. And like, that is something tangible that you can do that will help the planet even just a little bit.
You could also
Absolutely.
volunteer or donate to the New Jersey Tree Foundation.
Yeah, volunteer with us.
That is a great option.
Or the Sourland Conservancy.
Or the Sourland Conservancy. So
Yeah.
we'll send, after this, we'll send notes out about ways you can connect with those two organizations and support them. Noemi put a note in the chat that says The Big Fix is a recommended read for people who are looking for strategies to tackle the climate crisis. And Ariel, I see your hand. Do you want to have
I just want to say that
comment? Yeah.
Dayenu and the BK Dayenu, that one of our main goals is to try to divest from fossil fuels and try to get synagogues and other Jewish institutions across the country to divest from fossil fuels and to think about where we bank. And so, that's at the foundation of all of this. And I think I want to go back to what Eve said in the beginning, which is that trees are an entry point for people. And that it's just really, really important not to lose hope, because without hope, we really do have nothing. And both Eve and Crystal, you both seem very young to me, and your idealism and your hope and your strength comfort me and inspire me. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate it. This is so lovely.
Thank you both very much. I don't have anything to add to that, Ariel. Oh,
I
Thank
was
you.
responding to a question
well,
in the
just
chat.
to give everyone time to read Crystal's good note in the chat, I will share on the what can we do question that one of the things that's been really inspiring to me about working with BK Dayenu has been all the levels at which we can engage and make change. We can think about aligning our personal habits with our values. We can think about the work we can get our hands on locally. We can think about the politics we can influence locally at our town and county and state level. And we are in a network that is national and international of people who care about this. And we can come together and take strategic action with them. And so I'm trying to just like touch all those levels over the course of the week or the year. To me has been very energizing to feel like we are in community with people who care about this and are looking to try to turn this big ship. Yes, so thank you to the person who put that in the chat, that there's a famous saying, of course, that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago and the second best time is today. And that to me seems like an emblematic sort of response to the what should we do about the climate crisis question, because of course what we should do is go back 40 years and not put the fossil fuel into the air. And the next best thing we can do is whatever we can do today, including these types of educational programs that are inspiring us to take further action. So thank you all again. Thank you very much to Crystal and Eve. And
Thank you
look
for
out
having me.
for email from us about our next steps.
What a performance she is. Eve.
Oh, thank you. Have a good night,
Thank you.
everybody.
Good night.
Wonderful
Maybe-
program. Thank you. Relevant for second two.
Good night, Julia.
Good night,
Bye,
everybody.
Good
Julia.
night, everybody.
Awesome job, Eve. And
Thank
everyone.